It's Kevin. Welcome back to Relationship Ready. I hope this is helpful and you're getting a lot out of it. And I hope you'll get a lot out of it today too. And I hope it doesn't stress you out. New things you learn, new things you try. Because today we're going to talk about anxiety in relationships. Anxiety is everywhere. It's the new thing. Everybody's got anxiety. If I ask you to do something for you, it's anxious. If your boss asks you to do something, the world is amuck right now. There's a lot of extra anxiety from the way the world is now too, in many different ways. So what do we do with it? How does it affect relationships? Where are we at? Well, so today, think for a moment, what are you anxious about? Now don't start obsessing on it. That adds a whole nother layer. And we'll talk to that. That's when you get stuck. But what are you anxious about right in this moment? Because most of anxiety is not in this moment. If you're sitting here watching this, you're probably generally okay. There might be some difficult things you're dealing with or difficult things you have to think about, but you don't have to think about them right now, not in this moment. So we're going to break down the difference between anxiety, hypervigilance, and sensory overload, because those get very confused amongst people. And the number one factor in relationships is emotions, and particularly anxiety gets passed along. People feed off each other's anxiety, feed off of their stress. And anxiety is just this big blanket over all the other feelings. So part of the help is figuring out what those other feelings are. But let's start by talking about what a definition of anxiety is. Anxiety is a feeling of worthlessness, unease, typically about an imminent or uncertain outcome. So you don't know what's going to happen next. You're not in the present, you're in the next moment. There's a lot to be anxious about in the future. There's a lot to have been anxious about in the past. In some situations, there's a lot to be anxious about right now, because there might be an imminent or uncertain thing happening right now. But most of the time that's happening next. It's not happening right now. And anxiety gets really confused with hypervigilance and with sensory issues. So what's hypervigilance? Hypervigilance is extreme or excessive tension. You're abnormally alert to a potential danger or a threat. So if your cat jumps out here, if you get a phone call or a text, you might be reacting. Your body, your nervous system might be reacting. Because what vigilance is a reaction to an actual threat, to an actual thing that's a surprise. But hypervigilance is being overly reacting. And the more we can recognize we overly react, the more you're going to be like, that's my partner, they overly react. No, let's look at ourselves first. Because maybe they overreact, but we do too. So look at where your vigilance might be. And vigilance is a normal protective skill that we all have. But hypervigilance comes from being stuck, usually in some kind of trauma. The definition of trauma is very wide, but usually in some kind of form of trauma. Maybe your dad was an alcoholic and he came home drunk half the time and he was a great guy the rest of the time. Maybe he screamed, maybe he yelled, maybe he went into rage and was a rageaholic. Don't know. Maybe your mom had stress and anxiety. It was like, you got to clean your room all the time. I know my mom did, but that's not a big complaint because that was her anxiety. It wasn't my anxiety. I didn't know that at the time, but I learned, and that's part of what we need to learn. So hypervigilance is from a trauma thing of how we react to an actual threat or an actual danger. And we've all experienced some dangers and threats in our lives, but if we carry those with them now and take those into other situations that are not that threat, that's the hypervigilance. And then it gets confused with sensory overload, because we're all sensitive to our five senses. Got the lights, overhead lights on here. I like to keep it soft in here when I'm not recording. because that's a sensory overload for me and many people. But it's all your senses: your feeling, your touch, your sight, your taste, what you react to. You don't like hot stuff? All right, that's a sensory overload. So how does that relate to anxiety? Well, anxiety is walking around this world with all these sensory things coming in at us at all times. That's why they warn you about lights at theaters. Me doing my fingers like this, that might be a sensory overload too. So, trigger warning for those of you who are triggered. But it's not a trigger if you become aware of it and aware of the sensory overload. And so, become aware of what you do, what your partner does. Maybe they always chew too loud. That's a sensory overload for you. But they're all over the place. Because maybe they're not chewing too loud. Maybe they just chew. But you react. Because we're all built differently. And that's okay. So part of it is figuring out the difference between anxiety, hypervigilance, and sensory overload. But it's all related. All those. And you don't have to have any of it. Because maybe you're just okay. And that's okay. And maybe your partner is just okay. And that's okay. Because the thing that creates a problem with anxiety, with hypervigilance, or with sensory overload is when you stay stuck in it. Let me say that again. When you're stuck in it. When you can't recognize it, and you're coming back to those overload, those vigilance, that anxiety from things from before that you can't let go of, and you stay. And how do you let go of them? You become aware of them, you recognize what they are, and you pass your anxiety back. Maybe you got to pass your anxiety back to your mom, maybe to your grandmother, maybe to an old partner, maybe to the first person you ever had sex with. You got to pass that anxiety back. Now, do you go and find them and do that? No, but you come to terms with it yourself and pass that anxiety back. So how do you start practicing this? Use your coping skills, use your techniques. Taking breaks is okay. If you're feeling put on the spot, you're overloaded, you're anxious, you can talk to your boss, you can talk to your partner, you can say, I just need a minute. Let me get a drink of water. Let me use the bathroom. Let me give a moment. Because when you take that break, that's a break from the panic of that anxiety, that overload. And then your frontal lobe clicks in again. Because that doesn't work when you're overloaded. It shuts right down. You got nothing in your frontal lobe. You can't think straight. That's okay. It's emotions. So take that break. Start to learn to compartmentalize and be like, this isn't the same as that old thing. It's not the same as that future thing. It's different. You start to compartmentalize. Alarm, a little sensory overload for me. So I'm going to compartmentalize and be like, all right, that's an emergency. It's not my emergency. Right now, I'm present with you. And I might feel bad or have empathy for struggles that somebody else is having or where that fire truck is going to. But right now, I'm okay. That's compartmentalizing. And the number one strategy I ask everybody to use, breathe. Breathing just slows everything down. Slows down the panic, slows down the anxiety, slows down the hypervigilance, slows down the sensory overload. But you can't tell somebody to relax. That's probably the worst thing you can say to your partner when they're stressed. But if you agree ahead of time, you can go, would it help if you remind me to breathe? Sure. Maybe you're not breathing as well. It only helps. So take a breath. And be present with me. Let go of some of that anxiety or that past stuff. And then you can let go of it in your relationships. So what are we talking about today? Anxiety in relationships. It's always there. But it's not a problem unless you get stuck in it. And hypervigilance, sensory, anxiety, weeding out which is what and whether you're stuck, that can only help. So, in order to identify what's your primary, you primarily go with anxiety, are you primarily hypervigilant? Are you very sensitive to sensory stuff? You'll know. And if you don't know, your partner's got an opinion, I can assure you. Be open to it. And then decide whether it's fits for you or not. Get other help. That's how we become more relationship ready. So decide what you're going to do today to help identify what's in your relationship and how you create a little more peace for you and your partner. That'll make you much more relationship ready. Thanks for watching and subscribe. I'm Kevin. See you next time.